You got a raise this year, 3%, maybe 4. Your manager called it a strong year. HR sent a congratulatory email. You should feel richer. And somehow, by the time rent went up and groceries went up and gas went up, despite earning more money, you ended the year feeling poorer. You assume it's you. Bad budgeting. Lifestyle creep. Too many small purchases you can't quite account for. That shouldn't happen. Yet for millions of people, it does. Economists have known why for decades. And the strange part? It isn't because people suddenly forgot how to budget. It's because there's a number that's been quietly pulling away from your paycheck for the last 50 years. It's called the productivity pay gap. This is the story of where your raise actually went. Most people assume pay and output move together. Work harder, produce more, get paid more. That's how it's supposed to function. That's how it did function for decades. From 1948 to around 1979, worker productivity in the United States rose, and hourly pay rose right alongside it. Two lines on a graph climbing together. Then, sometime around 1979, the lines split. Since then, according to that same research, net productivity has grown by roughly 64%. Over that same stretch, typical hourly pay has grown by around 17%. Not 17% a year, 17% total across more than 4 decades. Workers kept producing more. The paychecks simply stopped following. Here's where it gets strange because the money didn't vanish. It went somewhere. Economists Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, using more than a century of tax records, mapped exactly where. In 1980, the top 1% of earners in the United States took home roughly 10% of all national income. By the most recent data available, that share has climbed to somewhere near 20%, in some years higher. The gap between what workers produced and what workers were paid didn't disappear into inefficiency. It moved upward, concentrated, year after year, into a smaller and smaller group of hands. But that's only half the story, because even the raise you did get is worth less than it looks. Imagine getting a 5% raise only for prices to rise by 6%. You celebrated, but your purchasing power actually fell. Economists call this money illusion. It describes something almost embarrassingly simple. We naturally judge our salary by the number on the paycheck, not by what it can actually buy. A 3% raise feels like progress. But if inflation that year runs at 4%, you didn't get a raise at all. You took a pay cut, and your brain told you it was good news. This isn't a glitch in human thinking. It's a permanent feature of it. And for 50 years, it's made stagnant wages feel like slow progress instead of what they actually are. Companies have always understood this, even if quietly. Framing a raise in nominal dollars rather than in terms of actual purchasing power keeps morale higher at a lower real cost. It isn't dishonest exactly. It's simply built around a well-documented blind spot in how people process numbers, one that's been measured and remeasured by behavioral economists for nearly a century. It's not unique to one country either. Similar patterns have shown up in the United Kingdom, Canada, and much of the European Union since the 1980s, in research tracked by the OECD, the international body that monitors economic data across developed nations. The gap opens at different speeds in different places, faster in the US and UK, slower in countries with stronger labor protections, but the underlying shape repeats. Productivity climbs. Pay lags. The distance between the two lines becomes the story economists spend entire careers trying to explain. Here's the part almost nobody quotes. While all of this was happening to average paychecks, executive pay followed the opposite trajectory entirely. In 1965, the average CEO at a major American company earned around 20 times what their typical worker made. By recent measurements from the Economic Policy Institute, that ratio has climbed past 300 to 1. Not because those executives started producing 300 times more value, because the same decoupling that flattened worker pay simply never touched the room where executive compensation gets decided. One economist, reviewing decades of compensation data, described it plainly. The productivity gains were real. They just stopped being distributed the way they used to be. One manufacturing worker spent 11 years believing she was simply bad with money. Her factory became faster, her output increased, yet after adjusting for inflation, her pay had barely moved. She skipped coffees, packed lunch, budgeted carefully. Nothing changed, because the gap wasn't in her spending. It was already built into the system before her paycheck was calculated. The problem wasn't a single decision. It was a slow accumulation of them. Union membership declining from around a third of American workers in the 1950s to under 10% today, stripping away the collective bargaining power that once forced productivity gains to flow downward. Global outsourcing giving employers cheaper alternatives to raising local wages, automation raising output without raising headcount. Each shift small on its own. Together, they quietly rewrote who gets paid for growth. None of these forces announced themselves. There was no single policy, no single year, no single headline that read, "Wages have now been permanently decoupled from output." It happened the way most large structural shifts happen, gradually enough that each individual year looked normal, while the accumulated distance, measured decade over decade, became almost impossible to close. Zoom out, and the pattern stops looking like personal failure and starts looking like structural design. This isn't happening because an entire generation forgot how to manage money. It's happening because the machinery connecting effort to reward, the machinery that used to work, was gradually disconnected piece by piece over 50 years while everyone was still being told the old rules applied. Every financial advice column still frames it as a discipline problem. Cut the subscriptions, track the spending, build the budget. All of it useful, none of it addressing the actual gap because the gap was never sitting in anyone's spending habits. It was sitting in a chart most people have never seen. One line climbing steadily since 1979, the other crawling behind it, decade after decade, while the distance between them quietly became someone else's income. The raise still gets announced every January. The email still says strong year. The math underneath it simply stopped adding up to what it used to, decades before anyone currently working today was hired. So what does that actually mean for the number on your next paycheck? It means the gap you're feeling isn't a mystery and it isn't a personal shortfall. It's the visible edge of a line that split from another line back in 1979 and never rejoined it. Productivity kept climbing. Pay stayed behind decade after decade, while a different, quieter number kept climbing in its place.